Okay, chaps, off we go. This is about using a router to put inlays into timber. Um, we've got two purposes really. The one that's more commonly known is strengthening and repairing. So to either, if you've got a crack through the middle of something, you can put some butterflies on it, or you can equally do it for decorative purposes. And that's what I'm going to sort of go for tonight. First of all, strengthening or repairing. Here's one I made earlier, about 10 years ago. It's a garden bench made out of a couple of planks of ash, and I put butterflies through it. And it's butterflies that people sort of mainly know. It's been there such a long time that, as you will see, it's all got a bit sort of gnarled and woody, but the butterflies have held in there. Can't remember, we probably used external glue to hold those in. And it's all bolted down to some brickwork. So that's an example for starters. Other uses I've used it for, and work on mending tables and things. So here are a few of the shapes that are traditionally used. Butterflies, which is what you've all probably heard about. The one with the diamond in is quite useful for doing sort of inlays on tables that might have, I had a particular one where it got a big burn in it. And if you put a diamond in and you have the grain running parallel with the grain in the table you're mending, it actually loses it quite well because of that shape. That's another example. Anyhow, and using the same sort of timber, of course. What I'm going to talk about is the fundamentals of doing the job. And here's the basic method. You do a design, you make a template. That's then used to use the router and cut the recess in the workpiece. You use the same template to make an inlay. We'll come to the details of that. And then last of all, you stick it in and smooth it all up and finish the job. As we say, the devil's in the detail. The equipment that you require. A router, best with a plunge facility. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then we fit to the bottom of a router a guide bush set. Again, I'll be showing some pictures of that. You may need adapter plates because guide bushes don't automatically fit into the bottom of your router, but that's another thing we can look at. Line-up pins, which help to centralize the bush into the router base. The type of cutter that you use is a straight cutter. You'll plunge into the wood and then work around the template to cut the profile. I'm using in this example that I'm going to show you another router, a second router, which you'll come to, and I'm using a small handheld router. The one that I'll be using for cutting the main shapes is quite big. It's a DeWalt. It's fairly heavy. It's a big beastie, and so if you're doing quite fine work, or you've got a very fine blade in it, taking out some of the hollowing is better done with another cutter. And to save changing cutters, I've used a handheld router. Various other bits and pieces, measuring gauges, cutting out the middle of the template with a coping saw, scroll saw, or a bandsaw, or whatever you like. I've used a bandsaw in the exercise, and then there are various other bits and pieces. So that's the fundamentals of the equipment. I was talking about the router, and I have an attachment on my router, which is called a plunge handle, which is extremely good because you can then plunge the router into the work one-handed. As you can see, you squeeze the bars, and that is dropping the motor because it's pivoted onto it. Has anybody else got a large router like that?
Got a large router with a double handle push and it's a twisty, clicky thing. It's a little bit strange.
Yeah, so some of the work you're going to be doing on this is really almost needs a third hand. So using this to push it down and get it set in place with it running it one-handed and then being able to put the lock on it is extremely helpful. The one I've got is made by a firm called Woodartproducts, and if anybody's interested, I've just put the address there. Woodrat makes some a special machine which is used for doing dovetailing, which is another little bit of kit I've got. It's a flat bed which holds a router, and then you have got two directional type cutting with it to make different shapes and grooves and trenches and what have you. Guide bush sets, important part of it. Here's one. It's a plate that fits in the bottom of the router, screws onto the base, and has a little upstand on it. And that is what you use to cut the profile of your shape you're going to make by rubbing that little collar around the template. Now for inlay work, we have a supplementary one, which is this extra collar here, which fits over the base plate unit and then offsets the blade. We'll do more about that a bit later. The one I'm going to be using for this example is a little bit more sophisticated. It was more expensive. It comes as a kit, the base plate with its collar, attaching ring, and also a cutter. It's got an 1/8 of an inch cutter we're going to be using in this example tonight, which is pretty small in a big router. This is the adapter plate, which then fits onto the bottom of the router.
So Richard, out of interest, is your router 1/4 inch, 3/8, half?
It's a 1/2 inch, and in fact, in this case, because that had a 1/4 inch shank, I had to put a collet in it to space it out. Haven't shown that, but here we are. And that's that unit assembled. The brass bits are screwed on with that plate on the back of it. When fitted on the bottom of the router, looks like this. So the base plate of the router is the Bakelite background there, and that is then just screwed in with a couple of screws. That's got some float on it, which is why you use an inlay pin to put into the central, the drive spindle of the unit to get it centralized so the blade is going around spot on in the middle of the guide bush.
So why do they do that? Why is it designed with slop? Do you know?
Well, I think to have a lot of float on the bottom.
Yeah, I've never got as far as doing this, but so why is there float? Why have you got a central? I mean, is it not designed? Well,
I think it's more a matter of clearance actually, because you've got about 1.5 mil clearance between the blade when it's fitted and that collar, and you match up blades and bush sets. So in fact moves it actually nicely to my next slide, which is taken from a trend catalogue, and you can see there are a lot of different sorts of bushes here, so which are for followers, going from whatever it is, a 10 mil guide bush diameter right up to 40 mil. So obviously you're going to be using different. So on a 40 mil guide bush, you're using a 40 millimeter or 31.8 millimeter cutter. I'm really too keen about having that whizzing around in front of my fingers, but there you go. I've shown that just to show the full range of things, and so they've obviously sized. You've got about 5 mil clearance then, haven't you, on that 4.1 gap on the guide bush to that blade there.
And the centering pin, it's just a dummy pin that you put.
Yes. Sometimes, there are available a sort of cone which you bring from above, and that does it for you. So that's pushed down into the spindle and centers it up. But the kit came with one of the kits I've got came with those centering pins. Okay. And then when I went and fit it the other day, the damn thing wouldn't fit in the chuck, so I put it on the lathe and machined it down, which was quite novel. So that's a sort of a brief look at the guide bushes, which are core to the whole thing. We'll come back to the thing. Oh, by the way, prices. I mean, these are all over the place. I think a guide bush set now would be somewhere between 20, and you can pay up to 30 or 40 quid for them, according to the quality of them. But they're obviously a decent range. But that's the trend lot that comes from there. Materials. This is what you're going to need to do extra and above the object timber, I've called it. And we're working on a flat surface tonight, really because you've got a flat base to the router, and frankly, to keep it nice and not wobbling around, you want to have a flat piece of wood to put it onto. And the other bits of material you need some MDF for making a template that we're going to have as our thing to follow around. It needs to be quite big, really, because of this size of the router. It's the one I've used for tonight's project is about 30 centimeters square, so it's got a decent bit of room to maneuver on. It needs to be thicker than the guide bush depth, which I think my guide bush is probably about 5 mil, so I've used 6 mil MDF to make our template in. Easier to work if it's that sort of thickness as well. Then you need a bit of timber for the insert. Make that reasonably thick because you're going to have to do some work on it a bit later. So I've said about 20 millimeters. And choose that in accordance with the job. If you want to have a contrasting inlay, obviously, you do that sort of nice piece of timber there to be darker or lighter as the case may be. Or equally, if you go back to that pine table I had somebody put a big hot pan on top of and had to dig it out. I found us near a closer bit of pine to put as the insert. Use some double-sided tape and glue and sandpaper. The good old 80 grit works wonders. So I'm going to move on to the whole procedure in some detail. First of all, we've got to make a template. The design you do, and I drew for tonight up on paper, ordinary on a little drawing board, exact size, full-sized, for the shape that you want to finish up with. You put around that shape a fence line, and that's set at a margin which is set to suit the guide bush, the bush collar, and the cutter radius. So as we were talking about earlier with that margin that's on the shutter. And I found this drawing was quite useful. There is the guide bush, which is going to follow the template with the cutter moving in the middle. So according to which part of the job you're on, you're going to be cutting either the outside of the template with a bit inserted, but you want to do the inside of the pattern for the hollowing out that you're going to do. So that's going to relate to where that face of the cutter is coming. And in inlay work, you notice that there was a collar for putting on the guide bush, which offsets the whole thing, and where therefore you can use one template for cutting both the inlay and the hole that it's going to go in. So you're offsetting it by that amount. There's the formula for doing it there if you're interested, but most of the guide bushes that you get will tell you exactly what the formula is. So for tonight's design, here we go. I'm going to put a piggy into the middle of a board for a chopping board or something. And looking at the design that we did, here's the outline that I wanted to achieve. And there is the margin. And for that particular bush that I'm using and that cutter, this had to have a 5.5 mil or 732 actually, because I think it was American, so it's in tooths, margin all the way around the outside. And the only other really important thing to think about there is the degree of fineness that you want to cut into the to the corners. So obviously, if you've got a too small a radius quarter, the cutter won't go into that corner when it's going around the template, and therefore it will dodge part of it. So I've set these radii to make sure that the cutter and the in that radius there actually will be suitable for the bush when it's fitted to the bottom of the router and is going to follow the template that we've cut.
So if you were going to cut a butterfly, though, they normally have sharp corners on them.
No, you would end up with rounded corners, as was shown up on the example we had a bit earlier. You could. No, you'd have to use a very, very fine cutter blade because it's a round cutter. It's always going to get around edges. An eighth of an inch gets you quite a fine cut, but of quite a small radius. I think the ones that I did earlier and showed as an example, I must have been using a much bigger cutter. I think I was using a 7mm cutter on those to do those. You need to transfer that. I used some good old carbon paper straight onto the MDF and hand drew through my drawing, going around the fence line and transferred that onto a template board. That's my piece of MDF, my 6mm to MDF. And then you got to cut it out. So basic cutting principles. I did this on my scroll saw. I set a 15mm hole in the corner here because that was going to be about the outside diameter of the guide with its collar fitted to it. See that when we get to it.
I suppose you could cut a template with a router if you did a template for the template.
Yeah, you could. And you can also, by the way, buy templates pre-made, so you haven't got to go through all that palaver in the first place. Of course, cutting dead on the line is what you want to get. Pretty impossible, so finish it off with a bit of sanding, files, you name it. Get it all nice and smooth to the angle, to the outline that you really want. Next step is to get your materials for job, and in this particular case I decided to use a bit of oak or a bit of old kitchen worktop, which is sort of what, about 30mm, 35mm thick, 32. And for the inlay I'm going to use a bit of teak, which was, I think that was about 20mm, as we said. I particularly wanted in this case to set the grain opposite to the main board, so that's why I've cut that to that sort of basic size for making the template, of making the inlay, sorry. You can see the overall sizes there. Set out where you're going to put the cut, build pencil line, use the template that you've just made, easy, draw it on there, and then stick the template onto it. On the right there, I had a secondary idea after sticking it on. I thought it might be useful to get the cutter or the base plate moving around the edge of it. I put some silicone grease on it. Should have done that before, but so it went everywhere. But just sort of to give the inside of the MDF a better sort of way of moving around it. So there we are, sort of more or less ready to start the job. But before that, you've got to set up the router. Again, this is a little bit more detail on that center pin. So middle view, there's the base of the unit. And as you can see, this router has got various holes there for fitting these base plates. I'm going to use the diagonal ones because that Lee, what do they make? Lee make dovetailing machines. Insert drops into that hole better with that pair of holes. So centralize it. Now, in fact, that plate stuck up a fraction, maybe a millimeter or so on my base plate, so I decided to pack it up. So I've got a nice big area to have flat to work when we come to cutting the template. So I just cut a couple of bits of cardboard and stuck them together. Important issue before you start the job: routers are dangerous. My one, I will go up to 20,000 revs. I did this job setting it roughly in the middle, something about 12K. I use all those three whenever I'm using a router. Kevlar gloves, which might just help a little bit in case we go flying off something. Next thing to do is to set the router up and set the depth of cut. I don't know if this is of interest to people, but with the big router and having depth gauges and things like that, you can get a really accurate way of setting it up. Anybody want me to go into detail there about how to set it up? I use some feeler gauges, and we use the turret, which is on the built into the router there. So let me just explode that a bit. There we are. So this is the turret. We bring down a post, which is controlled by a winder on the side of it, and you set it all up with the blade set onto the work surface that you're going to cut. So that gets your 0 point, and bring this down to the turret, but have used some feeler gauges here to keep it the amount, the depth that I want to go into cut, so that when you bring the thing back without the feeler gauges in, you've preset the amount of depth that you're going to cut into the timber. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, they all seem to be quite different, don't they, the way those settings work.
Yeah, that's right. It's quite good, this one, because you've got good accurate sort of up and downing, and also on the bottom of it here, which we will use later on, it's got a micro adjustment, which you can then make an alteration to without having to go through all this palaver with feeler gauges. I've got a set of feeler gauges which I use for it, which I've made myself, which are bits of aluminium of sort of 1.5 to 3 millimeters, and you can dig it up. Once you get over sort of 5 or 6 millimeters, then you can use a pair of a vernier caliper to get in the gap there. But it's not very easy up to that sort of depth, which is why I prefer this. It's quicker and easier. So I mentioned getting the offset, and for the first part, we're going to cut the hollowing out bit. So you want the blade, the cutter blade, to be nearer to the middle of the work, and that's why you fit this little collar onto it, and that pushes the blade towards the middle of the thing from the template. I just put this one in again for you to sort of get an idea of what that is. A general piece of work here, I was talking to Malcolm about this the other day, which is worth for knowing about for routers, is that to stop tear out, you want to get the blade cutting into the wood in the right direction. And so if you're going to go around the outside of a piece of wood, you go, actually, the usual rule of left to right, so you work along that, and then that is driving the cutter, which is going in a clockwise direction, into the wood, rather than if you were doing it the other way around, where it'd be chopping it out. If you were making the inside of a frame, you would in fact go the other way around. That's a sort of general rule for routing for you. In the particular case we're going to be doing, I don't think it makes a lot of difference, and I just went round clockwise because that felt easier for me. So we've now got to the real bit of cutting the border for the recess, and chaps, and this is it, in fact, after I've done it. So I've started out the router in this position, and the big trick on all of this, absolutely, and it's the most difficult bit, is making sure that that bush is kept hard up against the template all the way around. So you're pushing into the template, and you're also drawing it all the way around the profile. And so you can see from the profile how it has now cut the outside of the hollow that we're going to in fact be inlaying into. And John, as you see, you do get quite a tight corner there. So I'm now left with the baseboard, which has just got this 1/8 of an inch trench all the way around, The middle is still in, and the outside, of course, is there. So I'm left then with having the middle to get rid of. And if it wasn't such a small blade, I would just zigzag all the way over it. But I felt pretty nervous about that, so I decided to use my small palm router to take it out with a much bigger cutter. And here is the palm router. It's a Bosch. It's a really super little tool. It's very adjustable. It doesn't have a plunge facility, so if you're going to jump straight into it, you have to into a piece of work. You have to almost tilt it into the work. It's got about a 3-inch square bottom plate to it. I haven't shown it here with the cutter in it as easily as that, but the blade I'm going to use on here is a 1/2-inch cutter, and then I can work out the middle of the thing by setting the depth of it to the same as I had for the previous router. And just to go back, this is a trend depth gauge that I use for it. So placed across the base of the router, having preset my depth of cut I want. This sticks up. Has anybody got one of these? Anybody? No. It's a useful little tool for all sorts of other jobs, because at the top you can withdraw it, this scale rule, through the unit by the amount you want to depth to, and that is then giving you exactly the same depth at the bottom, between the bottom of the feet and the bottom of there. So you can place it across the blade, and here we are adjusting the router so the blade is sticking up the right amount to cut the depth of work. So having done that, we cut out the middle. But before I cut out the middle, and quite often with the palm router, because it's not got, you're doing it all by eye, you're not got a template to bump into, I mark out the boundary in bright red pen, so that when you're leaning over and the thing's rocketing around, this one goes in fast, I think it's got 30,000 revs on it, you can see where the blade is getting to, and you're doing that by eye. So having done that, you're left with most of the middle taken out. You've got to be so careful not to sort of run off piste and take a great lump out of the nice clean boundary that you made in the first place. So you'll see I've still got a few little bits left to get rid of, which I take out with a chisel and then clean it all up and make sure that we've got a good clean base to the for the inlay to be glued down to later on. And so that's going to be the hole that we're going to be fitting into. Yes, there is a bit of reasonable radius, but it's okay, acceptable in this case. And again, on the bottoms of it, of Piggy's feet that we've got there. We now take off that little collar from the bottom of the big router, the big yellow one, and that is going to then push the profile of the blade outwards hard up against the template that we're going to be using. The second thing we need to do before cutting the template is to increase the depth, because we want to put the we want to cut the inlay somewhat thicker than we've got a hole to put it into, such that we can finish it all off nice and tidily at the end of the day. So I gave it another 1 or 2 millimeters, and that's where the use of that little knob on the bottom of the depth gauge comes in usefully, because you just wind it in a bit and it's automatically getting the depth of cut to go further. Next thing to do is to put the template back onto the insert material. It's exactly the same template, just to say, and then we cut round again, exactly the same, and we end up here with this picture of the shape that has been round the piggy to get you the outside of the actual inlay. And that's what the cutter collar, the bush guide cutter collar, has offset it by that much between that point and the inside one. We take the block. In fact, I made it a bit smaller so that I could then cut through it to release the inlay on the bandsaw. So I set this cut up to come in just inside the router depth. And having cut that out of place, or cuts right the way through the block, going vertically and through the length of the block, we end up with a piggy in the block. Didn't actually get it totally right. A few little bits of hanging on in there, but it was easy enough to break out, cut out, and sort out. And there he is. That's ready to go into the hole. Now you'll find that it is actually a bit hairy around the bottom, and there are a few little bits and pieces that aren't quite as good as they need to be. So it does need finessing and sorting out before she'll get a nice fit into the hollow. Just do that with a bit of sanding and doing it, keep on offering it up, a bit like we do with normal turning work to fit something. Next one, glue it in. I use Titebond, great stuff. They say half an hour for clamping, but it's just about gone in about 2 or 3 minutes, I find. And you can see there that the extra depth that I gave it in making the inlay, so that it would be proud and I could plane it off, which is the next job. Plane it off, sand it, and get it really nice and smooth. I did it with a hand plane, and then I put a power sander on it. It had a few little hairline gaps around the edge of it, so the old trick of bit of dust and a bit of the old Titebond works wonders, rubbed in there, and then a final polishing off. So that's the job pretty well done, and here it is, all polished.
Wow, very good.
Very good.
And I think I'll be using it as a cutting board now. I might turn it. I might put it on and turn it round. We shall see.
I've got this piece of sycamore which has been lurking for quite a while. It's really dry. It's got some splits in it, and I'm going to try and turn it end grain into some sort of vessel, but mainly to experiment with how I can stabilise cracks and infill using butterflies or bow ties. In order to make sure it doesn't fly apart before I do anything, I've screwed some strips of scrap wood across the cracks before I turn it between sanders and put a tenon on it. This is very much an experiment, so I've just got a rough shape sorted out, and I'm now going to try and stabilise the cracks with some butterflies. Very quickly drew up a nominal butterfly shape and thought I'd program that into my Laser Pecker 2 and use that to burn that shape to an exact size onto the outside of the workpiece, and then also burn that pattern onto a timber blank, which I could then cut on the small bandsaw to make the actual butterfly, thereby making both of them exactly the same size. Well, why not? So I've just burnt some patterns in 30mm, ones in some, whatever it is, Winger, something, and some in oak that are 25mm as well. I'm going to try and cut these out on the little bandsaw and scroll saw now. See what Alright, first go with my Woodart micro drill GJ G800. it's almost silent. Got more noise from my head fan unit. So just using a little chisel and just smoothing it out and getting the corners nice and sharp. It's about 5 or 6 mil deep. Right, I don't know what this is going to look like. Well, it may not be pretty, totally pretty, but it will provide the mechanical strength that I need, if nothing else. I'm doing the second one, butterfly, just with hand chisels, and it's probably almost as quick. Thank you, Adrian, for the making of this mallet out of a piece of nylon I got from a silversmith that was retiring. Very nice of you to do it, works very well. Where the surface is reasonably flat, it's quite easy to get the laser pecker on it. Bit more difficult if the butterfly needs to go into a area with a sharp radius. So I've messed about doing these butterflies several different ways. Certainly burning it on with the laser is quite a convenient way of getting the shape, but actually I think just get a bit of double-sided tape, peel off the backing, get a decent marking knife. In this case it's a little marquetry one to mark the outline, which we've got it roughly tacked in place. About there. And I discovered the key thing is to make sure that when you mark out the outline, whether you do it in pencil to start with and then do it afterwards, is to get it as close as possible, which is why I'm doing it with the blade straight off, to the outline to get it as accurate as possible. It's a curved surface, so it will rock. But the key thing is to cut the surface of the fibres of the wood, so that when you actually then try and carve it out with whatever tool you're going to use, you've actually got a clean line at the surface that the fibres will part. And the other thing is, these are all done by hand, so make sure you mark where the butterfly will go, so that when you come to put it back on, you don't end up with it in the wrong place. I must admit, this Woodart micro motor tool just goes through the wood like butter, so you have to watch it. There's a foot control too, which makes it quite easy to take your foot off. Rather than using a hand chisel, this time I've used the Ryobi 4-volt electric carving chisel with a small bit on to dress the sides. I have to say that was extremely effective. For this sort of job, it's an excellent tool. Not a perfect fit, this one, so before the glue dries I just rubbed in some colour match sawdust, and then also sanded it in so that the actual sawdust from the wood fills the crack as well. Well, I've learnt as I've gone along, the key thing is that however you mark it out, I think you need to scribe the wood with a decent sharp cutter to cut the fibres, and then a Dremel or whatever to remove the waste, and then trim up onto the cut line with a decent sharp chisel of some description.